Welcome to this lecture on Web DuBois, the color line, and urban sociology. In this lecture, I would like to introduce the American classical sociologist Web DuBois, introduce his concepts, the color line among which, and then introduce the subfield of sociology, which is urban sociology, drawing on the mandatory reading for today, Massey and Denton's book on American apartheid, with the topic of racial segregation figuring central stage. So Web DuBois wrote more than 100 years ago, and one of his main topics was the color line in the United States, a topic which European classical sociologists largely ignored. Max Weber and Du Bois were in an active correspondence. They also met in St. Louis when Max Weber visited the United States. And Du Bois was much of a source to Max Weber to inform him about the problem of race in the United States, something that Weber only knew about secondhand. Du Bois wrote then about the problems of racial inequalities, which up to the current date characterize the United States society. And I wanted to show you this along three different dimensions. First of all, there's obviously the economic dimension of racial inequality. On the left-hand panel here, you see wealth inequality around the last 150 years. And on the y-axis, you see the factor by which total household wealth of white households exceed black households' household wealth. You see this before the abolition of slavery. There was an enormous wealth gap, with white households owning almost as much as 60 times as much as black households. This then strongly declined up to about the 1920s. But you also see that ever since, the decline has been rather stagnating, such that in the recent decades, the factor by which white households' wealth exceeds black households' wealth hovered around 6 to 8. So still a large, basically wealth gap, racial wealth gap. On the right-hand side of this panel, you also see one of the primary drivers of this wealth gap, which is housing. So for most, in particularly lower and middle income class households, housing makes up the major item in households' wealth portfolio. And you also see that obviously tenants mostly do not own any kind of housing wealth. Homeowners do, but the home ownership rate between African American and white households in the United States has been persistently different. So at around 1870 here, you see that white households exceeded black households' home ownership rates by around 49 percentage points. This was reduced then to around 26 percentage points at the beginning of the 20th century. But you also see that despite common increases, particularly in the post-war periods with the suburbanization and mortgage extension in the United States, the homeownership gap between white and black households did not decrease significantly anymore. So when this article here closes in 2007, there was still a home ownership gap of 23 percentage points. And ever since, with the foreclosures and the subprime crisis in 2008, this has even been increasing. If this first dimension of racial inequalities interests you further, check out this YouTube tutorial video of a recently published economics paper, which details with very interesting data the different drivers of, in a way, household wealth along the color line since 1949. A second dimension along which black and white households still differ are the mortality and life expectancy rates. So here you see a depiction of the deaths per 100,000 inhabitants in the United States by gender and race over the last 100 years. And you see a common trend, which is a decline in mortality rates. This is due to the hygiene and the health revolution, the decrease in particular of infant mortality rates. But you also see that the ranking by gender and race here was relatively stable over time, and that there has been a persistent race gap in mortality rates between, in particular here, the white and the black males, with black males in the United States still showing significantly higher mortality rates per population than their white counterparts. This also translates into life expectancy at birth, which you see on the left-hand side here of the panel, which I drew from The Economist. The number of years that a newly born at the respective date here was expected to live, then differed systematically between the white and the black population in the United States. Even though there has been a certain catch-up process, there's still a significant difference in the most recent years between these two kinds of populations. So the third dimension along which white and black population in the United States differs is education. Here on the right hand side, you see the share of the over 25-year-olds with a bachelor's degree in the United States. And you see that the white population here again holds significantly more bachelor's degrees than either Hispanic or the black population, despite a common increase again, but there's also no sign in recent years of the black population to catch up. So these are just three dimensions of racial inequalities in the United States, which have been with Web DuBois at the time of his writings more than 100 years ago, and which are still with us today. And that's also a dimension, so the dimension of the color line of racial differences, which are a clear blind spot also in European classical sociology, which is why we introduced this in this lecture. So William Edward Burkhardt, or simply Web DuBois, was born around the time of Weber's in 1868. Clearly outlived Max Weber, was a contemporary of his still. And he was the son of freed slaves in the north of the United States, with also, I think, a grandfather from Haiti, which is why we see this French-sounding name. And so Web DuBois lived in a lower or middle-class kind of family, was able to attend Fisk College and then Harvard University, and majored in history. He also had an exchange year at a German university where he studied with the historian Gustav Schmoller from the German Historical School, who was also one of Max Weber's acquaintances and teachers. In the United States, he also was in touch with William James, who's known as one of the founders of American pragmatism. American sociologists at the time frequently studied at least a year in Germany, because German universities were seen a bit as the model to follow in the United States, something which changed after the First and Second World War in particular, when it was rather German sociologists visiting the States in order to keep up with professional knowledge. Yeah, at the time, this was still the other way around. And Web DuBois also then majored not only in history, also wrote his dissertation on a historical topic and mainly looked at how the US supported and also benefited actually from slave trade even after its formal abolition in 1808. His first writings then are very much in empirical sociology with his treatise on the Philadelphia Negro in quotation marks. So at the time of writing, it was still common to use this term also in book titles, even though we wouldn't use it today. And this treatise basically on racial segregation in the 7th Ward of Philadelphia introduced very much urban sociology and founded what may be called the Atlanta School of Sociology at a black college then in Atlanta, where Web DuBois had a couple of PhD students who worked on similar topics and did not only do scholarly work, but also engaged in reform activities. Reform activities then became more and more the center of activity of Du Bois, who joined the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909. In the 1900s, he also wrote what is probably his major publication, The Souls of Black Folk, of 1903, and gradually moved from actually being an academic into being more of, let's say, a public intellectual, a reformer, and also newspaper editor of the crisis. He considered himself to be part of what he once referred to as the talented 10th. So something like the Black elite to promote African American civil and political rights, which is very much the counter program to Du Bois' main adversary at the time, Booker T. Washington, who, in his rather conservative Atlanta Compromise, mainly suggested an economic integration of the Black population in the United States through industrial education kind of strategy, and accepting basically the civil and political inequalities of the time. So Washington was very much then cherished by the white establishment, obviously, and Du Bois was something like the young challenger at the time, who eventually probably also was more successful. Throughout the 20th century, then Du Bois' activities shifted once again to something like a Pan-African movement, also interested in colonialism. He had a real interest also in socialism, and engaged also in this long-term plan of an encyclopedia, which saw its days then as the Encyclopedia Africana eventually. Over the 20th century, he was a real international public figure, met with all kinds of politicians, presidents of the world, and was very much in the international peace movement and anti-imperialist movement. Towards the end of his life, then hunted by the FBI, sought exile in Ghana, where he also inspired the movement for independence. And he left us with more than 20 books, also several novels, among which also autobiographies. Here's a classic, like a standard biography, also cited in the footer here, in case this interests you further. So Du Bois basically puts what he calls the race problem center stage of his sociology in general. And I wanted to introduce just some of his key notions before moving on to one of his legacies, namely urban sociology. So one key term that describes, let's say, the state of African Americans is the notion of double consciousness. And I quote here from his book, Sowell's book, quote, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two wearing ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of this drive, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost, unquote. So the double consciousness then describes, in a way, a psychological dualism, or in sociological terms, also just a role conflict that African Americans have been faced with, that Du Bois also himself experienced. And it basically describes that in like even everyday kind of moments, African Americans are always reminded to not just be citizens of the country, but to basically been treated as a kind of second class citizen. Um, so for Web DuBois himself, this was particularly noticeable as he also saw a certain alienation of the Black elite to which he pertained himself from then the broader Black population. Um, so one of the legacies of Du Bois' writing is to basically attack biological definitions of race. And I quote again here from his 1890s writings, quote, "What then is race? It is a vast family of human beings, generally of common blood and language, always of common history, traditions, and impulses, who are both voluntarily and involuntarily striving together for the accomplishment of certain more or less vividly conceived ideals of life," unquote. So the definition of race by Web DuBois encompasses, let's say, many sociological features such as the common history, tradition, common language, and is opposed to, let's say, the more common biological definitions of race that even the British sociologists that Web DuBois was familiar with, Herbert Spencer in particular, defended. So these sociologists were motivated by an evolutionary theory of society and of races, and Web Du Bois very much criticizes this evolutionary notion of race and opposes it with the idea that races are socially constructed, such that basically every society determines through socialization processes, yeah, through institutions, the kind of racial definition that it eventually follows. In his very concrete work, then Du Bois looked at the problem of urban poverty and of racial segregation through the lens of Philadelphia's 7th Ward, where he spent 1.5 years himself interviewing more than 1,000 people, getting census material, and initiating, in a way, the urban sociology that is still with us nowadays. You just see here one of the many illustrations that he already uses in his work here of, that is the 18th and 17th then streets of the 7th Ward at the time, already using, in a way, the color color mapping that urban sociologists still use today, and describing the early patterns of racial segregation at the time. So urban sociology is basically also what then in the official record of American sociological history then figures as the starting point of the Chicago School. Chicago School then was basically a white sociology founded in the 1910s, having roughly 2 generations of sociologists who studied basically Chicago as the laboratory of social change at the time. The most important writing founding this Chicago School is probably Parks and Burgess' basically article on the city, which established at the time one pattern of urban segregation and growth, taking again Chicago, which you see depicted here on the right-hand side, as the model. So you see that um, this model of city growth describes how the city was segregated in different layers around the center, which is the loop in this case, um, where basically you had something like the what is also called the ghetto and slum areas in the first layer around the circle. You have the sort of second zone here and the third zone with working class homes, also with German immigrants, and the fourth layer here with the residential zones and single family dwellings. So concentric city growth is one of the sort of standard assumptions of this model, which is basically using an adaptation of biological processes in order to describe the city. This is also called urban ecology. The idea being that just citizens in the city compete for space. They order space according to different moral principle. And instead of a natural order emerging, the city constructs in a way a social spatial order with segregation of different ethnic and also class groups. The Chicago School is also known for many monographies that have been published on different phenomena of mainly the 1920s and then 30s. All have sort of an urban sociology focus. Here are just a couple of the main titles: the Gold Coast and the Slum, very important one; the Middletown study, also by basically the Linz, a couple of sociologists who wrote basically about Middletown, that is a city in Indiana, which they studied in 1929, just at the start of the Great Depression. And they revisited the city in 1937 to basically offer a comparison of these two snapshots. One of the main findings was that everyday life in the so-called Middletown hadn't really changed so much despite the upheavals of the Great Depression. So the Chicago School, almost 20, 30 years after Web DuBois' writings, then officially institutionalized urban sociology in the heart also of sociology, and inspired up to the current day studies on urban segregation. The classical book in this context is probably American Apartheid by Massey and Danton, which you read for today, which traces in a way racial segregation in the United States since the late 19th century to the current day. And as the title already suggests, even though the United States are not as very much extreme as the South African society where the term apartheid comes from, it is, and we will see this also later on, probably one of the most segregated society that there is. So segregation and let's say the ghettoization of American cities have been observed in many classical works actually on the problem of race, and that is the case for The American Dilemma that was published by the Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal in 1944, giving in a way an external view on the problem of race. Also in the work Dark Ghetto of 1965, and again by the Kerner Commission report, which was published in reaction to the urban riots of the 1960s and led to one of the pieces of legislation which was meant to counteract racial segregation in US cities. So in all of these writings, the ghettoization and segregation have been prominent, but according to Massey Denton, this somehow got a bit lost with the housing laws of the Johnson administration. The problem of persistent urban poverty, particularly among the African American population, has traditionally received these four different kind of explanations, which Massey and Danton mention, but which all have also their problems. And the main problem is that they ignore actually segregation as one of the main causes also of this persistent urban poverty. So a cultural explanation is that this, let's say, culture of poverty that makes poverty persistent. So once people are unemployed, once families are disrupted, or once childhood is disturbed, then in a way poverty becomes a transgenerational kind of phenomenon. A problem of this kind of culture of poverty explanation is obviously that it ignores a bit where the culture originally comes from. And most likely it is about structural causes that produce this kind of poverty, which is why, let's say, structural explanations about economic changes might be more relevant. One key structural transformation that took place in American cities at the time was the creation of the Rust Belts, that is the large-scale deindustrialization of American cities in the the northeastern regions in the United States, which left many of the Black population then unemployed in the cities they had migrated to in the Great Migration. So structural economic explanations are probably one important part, but we will see also in a second that the ghettoization or let's say the large-scale segregation of American cities preceded already the wave of deindustrialization of the 1970s. A third kind of explanation is just racism, individual racism or institutional racism by the white population against the Black population, which acts through schooling laws, or housing and housing policies. And yeah, we will see also in a second that this is very much an explanation that we see as a driver of residential segregation. A final kind of explanation that Massey Denton cite here is the one on welfare disincentives. So this is, let's say, a particularly conservative explanation of why there is a persistent urban poverty, and that is that the welfare state incentivizes sometimes the wrong kind of choices in families. So one example Massey Denton give here is that the welfare state supports just families without fathers, for instance, supporting these families with welfare and hence incentivizing the formation of these families. A very obvious problem with this kind of welfare disincentive explanation is that much of the urban poverty that Massey Denton described already existed a long time before these welfare policies even were put into place. So even before the start of Social Security of the 1930s, the urban ghetto was already a phenomenon in the United States, which is why Massey and Denton think that many of these explanations just share at least a common problem, that they ignore residential segregation as a cause, filter, or also amplifier of African American poverty in cities. So here's a brief history of racial segregation along their lines. So they describe in their book how segregation around 1890, when they gathered their first also data on segregation in cities, was relatively low before the Great Migration. That is before African Americans not only urbanized, that is, they moved from, let's say, southern sort of sharecropping farm arrangements to often northern industrial kinds of employments. Um, and at the time, the segregation levels in cities, so a very small part of the population, African American population, was even living in cities, but their segregation levels were actually similar to those of Irish or German immigrant groups at the time, who were also known to cluster, at least in certain cities. Um, segregation, and this holds actually over the entire time period up to the current day, was lower in the South. One of the reasons is also just the building arrangement or sort of urbanistic kind of arrangement. That is, there were grid patterns with so-called white avenues and black alleys, which led to a relatively segregated arrangement, but on a neighborhood level, still relatively mixed. In the South, there was also an all-white elite, whereas at this time, before the Great Migration in the North, also, yeah, with families like the one of Web DuBois, there was at least participation also of the Black elite in um, common in public life, in universities, etc. So then, with the Great Migration, starting around 1910, also with the demand for war time employment in the industrial North, then begins also segregation to rise in the cities. One mechanisms through which this happened was also racial violence in northern cities and even bombings of Black homes, which basically kept Black households out of white neighborhoods and forced them to move into largely Black neighborhoods. So, yeah, segregation was not necessarily here a question of choice, but it was really a question of violence then. Yeah. On top of, let's say, this individualized kind of violence came then institutions that institutionalized racism. Most importantly, then historically, before the federal institutions came in place, so local institutions such as neighborhood associations or real estate boards, who made sure that, let's say, neighborhoods could pass certain so-called restrictive covenants, which basically just stated anyone who wants to move in the neighborhood has to be white, as plainly as that, or these covenants determined also certain building sizes, let's say a number of bathrooms, certain plot sizes, which made it economically almost impossible for Blacks to move in. So these kind of associations were also supported then by real estate agents and their boards, who also made sure that real estate agents just wouldn't sell houses in white neighborhoods to potentially Black buyers. These restrictive covenants were outlawed in a Supreme Court decision in 1948, but we will see also in a second that they have been replaced by different kinds of, let's say, more indirect ways of institutional racism. At the time, also cities themselves used ordinances in order to maintain segregated patterns of residences, and all of this led to basically segregation of education, housing, and also the labor market at the time. Through the additional migration during the Great Depression and World War II into the northern cities, where housing shortages were dominant, segregation levels even increased much further. Since the 1940s, sociologists can also use opinion polls, which also demonstrated a very strong individualized racism. So most basically white respondents then answered that they wouldn't want to live in a Black neighborhood, or that they wouldn't want Black neighbors. So a combination of also individualized and institutional racism. Institutional racism then was entrenched in the housing institutions which were put in place during the Great Depression, and which very much governed the suburbanization wave in the post-war period up until the 1970s. The two central institutions with discriminatory mortgage lending practices were the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, and the Federal Housing Association Administration, FHA. The HOLC was in a way a bad bank that bought mortgages that were underwater in the Great Depression, and handed out new mortgages to these homeowners underwater, but only to those homeowners who were resident in non-risky zones. And the HOLC then created, in a way, risk maps of American cities by 4 different categories of risk, and would give out mortgages only in the less riskier kind of zones. And as it happened, then a critical criterion for determining riskiness was also the share of African American population. So redlining refers in a way to the red color that was attributed to the most risky zones on these risk maps of mortgage lending by the HOLC. And incidentally, then these reddish zones were those where predominantly African Americans lived. The HOLC was basically just a bad bank institution, but the redlining practices were also taken over by then the Federal Housing Administration, who insured and gave out mortgages in the post-war period on a much larger scale, including also the Veterans Administration that gave out mortgages to veterans, but also the private banks followed this original zoning, racialized zoning in a way of the HOLC, and thus entrenched institutional racism through the mortgage market. So, in brief, African Americans who wanted to access basically mortgages were discriminated against on the grounds of them buying in risky zones where they wanted to live. One last reinforcing mechanism through which federal institutions entrenched this segregated patterns was also public housing construction and urban redevelopment. So what happened is that federal money was often used to get rid of mostly African American neighborhoods with a resettlement of the population in rather peripheral zones in public housing projects, which were largely underfinanced and led also to bad housing conditions, but also reinforced existing segregation patterns. They also helped to just create this post-war division of American cities into the white suburbs and the Black inner city. parts, which we already saw a bit emerging in the map from the Chicago School. So why is this at all relevant? I mean, segregated cities, is this good or bad? Massey and Danton in their book in the later chapters then show that segregation actually adversely impacts individuals through a mechanism which nowadays sociologists call context effects. So context effects are effects that describe what a neighborhood does to individuals independently of the individual's sort of characteristics or other individuals' characteristics. So if you place the very same person at random in a good versus a bad neighborhood, then the neighborhoods determine the outcomes of this individual just by themselves. So in the case of the bad neighborhood, then they lower the individual's life chances, in particular in the spheres of education, labor markets, and housing. And through these context effects, then if you grow up in a bad neighborhood, you're disadvantaged from the start, which is why segregation is a problematic sort of affair. So to sum up, Massey and Danton then described that at the height of their study on segregation, quote, 1/3 of all Americans in the United States then live under conditions of intense racial segregation. They're unambiguously among the nation's most spatially isolated and geographically secluded people, suffering extreme segregation across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Black Americans in these metropolitan areas live within large, contiguous settlements of densely inhabited neighborhoods that are packed tightly around the urban core. In plain terms, they live in ghettos, unquote. Okay, so to arrive at this statement and this broad narrative of American segregation, Massey and Danton are also known for having made use of the, let's say, classical repertoire of urban sociology, which is measuring segregation. And I wanted to briefly introduce the key measures that the two authors use also in their study, which is on the one hand the dissimilarity index, also called segregation index, for the case that there is just one minority and a majority in the neighborhood, in the city, and the exposure index, which is basically the inverse of the isolation index, which the authors use a lot. So these two indices measure the different dimensions of segregation, of unequal sort of distribution of individuals across urban space, which this little graphic here on the right-hand side helps to explain. So each of these arrangements here depicts a city, say, and the dots then describe individuals who are grouped in the city. They are of a minority, in this case, a minority is black points and majority of your white points. The dimension of evenness then describes basically, so that is measured by the dissimilarity index, describes how unevenly or evenly the minority group is distributed across urban space. So both of these indices range from 0 to 100. And the index or uneven, or the evenness then is lowest, namely 0, when all of the minority members are equally represented in all of the different neighborhoods in a city. So this is roughly the case here on the upper left-hand side, where you see that in all of these neighborhoods, so think about little neighborhood circles around these dots, then you have an equal share of black points in relation to white points. the similarity index would be most uneven when you basically have all of the minority population gathered in one neighborhood only. So basically the situation of a ghetto. In these cases, the dissimilarity index reaches a number of more than 50%, perhaps even 80 or maximum 100%. If the dissimilarity index is 80%, then you can also interpret this index as saying that 80% of the minority population has to move to other neighborhoods in order to make the distribution across neighborhoods equal again. Yeah. So this state of uneven distribution would be reached here on the lower left-hand side, where you see a clustering of the black points here in predominantly three kind of neighborhoods. So this would yield a higher dissimilarity index. Okay, so the dissimilarity index measures the evenness or non-evenness of the population by minority and majority groups over urban space. The exposure or isolation index, in turn, describes a different dimension of segregation, which is how exposed are you to members of your minority group or the majority group. So the exposure index is very high when you have basically a lot of exposure to members of the other group, and it is very low when you have only exposure to members of your own group. So in a way, in terms of measurement, the exposure index looks at how the average, in this case, minority member, is sort of exposed times the majority members of every neighborhood, or how likely is it that the average minority member encounters a majority member in a specific neighborhood. Yeah. So where the dissimilarity index measures in a way the deviation of the distribution of the minority from the ideal equal distribution, the exposure index sort of measures a much more sort of everyday kind of interaction dimension. That is, how likely are you to meet someone from the other group in your neighborhood? One crucial feature of the exposure index is also that it depends on the size of the minority and majority. The larger the minority is, the more likely you are also to encounter someone from the minority, independently of how they are distributed over time. In the empirical study, you see that the dissimilarity and exposure index, with their dimensions of evenness versus exposure, are relatively similar actually over time, but they do measure different dimensions. So in general, they can be influenced through two broad tendencies. The one tendency is you have a selective migration coming into the city. That is, for instance, through the Great Migration, the newly arriving population settles selectively in certain neighborhoods only. So the anchor point theory of migration, for instance, predicts that people rather settle in neighborhoods where they already know sort of family members or friends, often from the same ethnic groups. And this anchor point theory would then predict that a selective migration may increase segregation, both as measured by dissimilarity or exposure index. The second kind of mechanism through which segregation can increase is then that there are general trends in the cities, such as rising house prices or rising rents, for instance, and the population in the city then reacts selectively to these trends. So when there are like rising house prices or rents, then the poorer households, for instance, might selectively move to the poorest areas and thus increasing segregation. Reversely, in context of gentrification, right? So when sort of rich people move to poorer neighborhoods because they think they are like the latest trend, gentrifying this neighborhood, you have a selective migration that goes actually against the segregation flow. So gentrification is one actually process through which selectively then segregation can be decreased. Okay, so these are different dimensions of measuring segregation, and you can actually apply these little formulas yourself. Go to any kind of website of city statistics, Berlin, for instance, or New York, and just look for minorities, majorities. You can do this by race, by gender, by income group, what have you, and you can calculate these segregation indices very easily yourself. So what are the long run trends then? And here I draw a bit on the economists Glaser and Victor's writings, who have used the similar techniques as Denton to describe basically the very same process that the two sociologists have been describing in their book up to the 1980s. That is, they observe a rise of both dissimilarity and isolation index from about 0.2 or let's say 20% up to then for the isolation index 50% and 80% for the dissimilarity index. So at the height of urban segregation around then 1970 in the United States, and this is then the average for all of the major American cities, the 80% of the Black population in the cities would have had to move in order to make the distribution across the city equal again. Yeah? And again, the likelihood for an African American to meet only African Americans in the neighborhoods in 1960s would be 60%. Yeah? So if people didn't work in their neighborhoods, if they just lived in their neighborhoods, the likelihood actually to meet a person of the white population would be very low. Ever since the 1980s, and this is where Glaser's work goes a bit beyond Massey Denton's, the upgraded numbers here also show that gentrification and immigration in particular brought segregation levels down. Yeah? So here by 2010, then segregation levels have been reaching again the levels of around 1920 again. And this is due to gentrification. So I mentioned this already. So this is a process in cities where richer households move to poorer neighborhoods, mostly because they think that they're artistically interesting, culturally innovative, cheap in housing. By moving there, they increase rents and gradually push out the resident population. But in this process, because in a way, rich households move into poorer neighborhoods, there's more mixture, hence less segregation than there would normally be. But immigration also lowered segregation levels. One other tendency that brought segregation levels down, according to Glaser, is that there's been a catch-up process in mortgage lending. So since the 1970s, there was the idea to extend mortgages more to African Americans, also in the subprime mortgage lending, to increase home ownership rates and also create more mixed cities. With the burst of the subprime bubble, however, this catch-up process might also have seen an end. Last but not least, the creation of the Rust Belt, the unemployment in northeastern cities led to a reversal of the migration flows of the Great Migration, and African Americans have been moving more and more also into the Sun Belt, breaking with some of the past dependencies that made ghettos so persistent over time. Still, we are now at a segregation or the similarity index of more than 50%. That is, in current American cities, more than 50% of the Black population has to move in order to equalize cities again. And in international comparison, this is still a very high value. So in this interesting article by Sonia Arbaci here, we find one of the rare comparisons of segregation levels, in this case, ethnic segregation, using different ethnic groups in European cities. And here's a comparison along the segregation index, so the similarity index that is, which you see depicted here on the x-axis. And this is just the percentage of immigrant population in the respective cities and countries on the y-axis. This is for time periods in the 1990s, however. Arabachi then notices that many of these cities cluster by welfare state types. So we will see in a future lecture that countries' welfare states are obviously not the same across countries. They differ quite a bit, and there are different sort of clusters, like the liberal cluster, to which the UK, but also the US pertain, is opposed to the social democratic cluster of the Scandinavian countries, or the corporatist kind of conservative welfare clusters, to which then also Germany belongs. In this context, it's interesting to see that it's only the Anglo cities in this case, so the British cities, which reach ethnic segregation levels as high as the United States. So this only holds perhaps also for some selective cities like Barcelona here apparently. But otherwise, segregation levels of more than 50% are rather unknown. And when you think about the most extreme levels here of segregation in an average American city of the 1970s of almost 80%, this is not even depicted on the European map. You also see that most European cities are rather below even 40%. The German cities mostly below 30% segregation index. So that is in the German case, for instance, here the Turkish and ex-Yugoslavian population was used to compose the ethnic segregation indices, and they then rather range below 30%, so less than 30% of this ethnic group would have to move in order to make the city equal again, which is much lower in comparison to the racial segregation indices in the United States, even despite the recent decrease. All right, so this was meant to introduce you to the urban sociology branch of sociology, which was very much inspired by Web DuBois' work on the color line, one of the first, if not the first, American urban sociologist. And the study of segregation, giving high house prices and rents, giving housing shortages, is still one very much done in the current day. This was the end of the lecture. Have a great day.